3.5 years to add an ending to my game. It isn't quite what I expected it to take, and seeing how there's still a lot of work left before the game itself is done, it paints a pretty daunting picture of the future. With that being said, it's apparently been close to 11 months since the last devlog, despite me often saying that I want to make more frequent devlogs, and then I don't. It's not really for a lack of progress, but more of a lack of planning, as this time it's because I worked on a big feature which kept ballooning in terms of how much work was needed. On top of that, I kinda messed up by stating multiple times that the next devlog was going to be about the ending of the game, Humanity's Colony. And now I get to start developing the ending of the game, which is Humanity's Colony, and then working on adding Humanity's Colony and adding an initial draft of the game's ending. Unfortunately, that meant a lot of work before the colony and ending of the game was in a state that I could make a devlog about, which is why there's such a gap between the last devlogs. Especially since it required way more work before I could even start on the colony. As for example, I needed to add in the stolen vehicle parts that I talked about in devlog 7 before I can actually get to the colony, as the vehicle and heat core isn't fully operational without them. You also need to be able to find these vehicle parts, so I had to add the Geiger counter compass that I mentioned in devlog 8, which luckily also doubles as a way for you to find the colony. Though it isn't enough to just collect the vehicle parts, as I didn't want it to be as boring as just plonking them into an inventory like it is with normal upgrades. And that meant that I had to add a building system, which ended up taking longer than expected since you're able to build things on a large moving vehicle. Not that it was a waste of time, as it's also needed for building chests, turrets, cover and other things. So it's good that it's done now, as it means that I can easily add more buildables later on. For example, some decorations for the ship and things you can find in city ruins. However, those features will be in another devlog, as this one will be way too long otherwise, and the fact that I actually do want to have more frequent and shorter devlogs means that splitting it into multiple is a decent choice. As you might know, Scorching Engines has a procedurally generated world with mostly procedural content. Except that I designed bandit camp buildings and then they get spawned randomly. Which means that the layout of the bandit camp is random, but the buildings are semi-random, as there is randomly spawned clutter around the buildings. I was thinking about doing the same for the colony, but since it's a pretty important part of the story and gameplay, I figured that I need to make sure that it plays nicely. Therefore, going fully procedural isn't an option, but going fully handmade doesn't entirely work, since it's going to be spawned in a procedural world. Therefore, I went with the solution similar to the bandit camps, with handmade buildings, but where the layout is also handmade, but which buildings go where isn't. What this means in practice is that I place down building foundations in the colony, and then they randomly rotate and snap to the terrain height, where they then also randomly pick a building prefab relative to their foundation size. Which means that the general layout is going to be the same for all terrain seeds, but the terrain itself is going to be different, as well as the buildings spawned in a specific spot. There's also handmade content that just snaps to the terrain, such as the colony gates and the docking platform for the vehicle, as they need to be in specific places. Currently, the colony walls are procedural palisade walls, as they need to snap to terrain and angle themselves accordingly, so there's no gaps. But that might change, as I don't want to have palisade walls for the colony, as it's supposed to be a bit more industrial and proper looking. Especially compared to the pesky raiders with their ugly camps. Currently the colony is somewhat placeholder looking, but the idea is for the construction of the colony to have been underway while the world was freezing, and then more people showed up and it expanded. So maybe there's going to be some proper parts with concrete buildings and thick walls, and then some outer parts with shacks and palisades, so there's more variety. Unfortunately, progress is slow and I'm bad at art. On top of that, the colony still isn't finalized in terms of size, design or gameplay, so a lot of things are subject to change. So there's still a lot of work left to do before I'm happy with it, but it's finished enough to be playable, although I really need to rewrite the enemy AI so they work better with it and provide some proper gameplay. Though, just like with every other devlog, I had to revise the terrain deformation quite a bit, both in terms of what terrain pieces get deformed, and in terms of how the deformation works, since I needed more functionality than I had previously. The most important one was to enable offsetting the deformers so I could have ramps and deformers that are more natural looking, as well as rewriting the logic for checking terrain to support larger deformers with better performance. The current gameplay for the colony is that once you have gathered all the vehicle pieces, you'll build a radio and be able to figure out where the colony is with the help of your radar. Once you get to the colony, you then have to dock the vehicle and connect the heat core to the steam vent. But unfortunately for you, it works much like the ship reactor in RimWorld, and the raiders have discovered the energy signature of the heat core charging. Because as previously mentioned, they want the heat core for themselves, as they're hellbent on either retrieving the heat core or capturing the colony instead, which means that now you need to help protect the colony while the heat core charges in a sort of final stand. And in order to provide some much needed variety in terms of gameplay, this will see you fighting on the parked vehicle and on the ground, preventing you from using the previous tactic of just driving away and having car chases across the wasteland. Previously, the enemy driving has been pretty awful, as they just drive in a straight line and therefore go straight through buildings, walls and trees. And since I want them to circle the colony before making their way through the open gate, I either have to add a bunch of separate logic for the case when the colony has spawned, or I rewrite the enemy driving to have some sort of collision detection, which is of course the route I went with, as enemies driving through buildings isn't quite right. I tried out a few different methods for this collision detection, but ultimately ended up with a context steering solution. That is that the AI has a limited set of directions it's allowed to move in, and by weighing different factors such as whether or not there's a wall or if said direction is pointing towards the target position, one direction is the best option for reaching said target position. For example, if there's no obstacles, then going straight towards the target is the best direction, but if there's a wall in front and to the right, then left is the best direction to turn in. But seeing how I ended up on research papers when trying to solve the issue of the AI getting stuck in dead ends, I gave up for the time being. But there's going to be a devlog specifically about the enemy vehicle AI and driving later on, so maybe I'll have figured out a solution for that. Since the gameplay now requires you to travel further to collect all the stolen vehicle parts across the wasteland, I quickly discovered that I'm not safe from a pesky little thing known as floating point errors. These are caused by the fact that floating point numbers, i.e. numbers with decimals, sometimes don't have enough memory for decimals in order to fully represent numbers, which can lead to errors that slowly accumulate. What this means for us is that as you're traveling with the vehicle looking for bandit camps, these errors slowly start accumulating the further you go from spawn, and before long the vehicle starts jittering and all visuals are breaking apart. Which is very much noticeable when aiming down sight, as the gun quickly became jumbled and started looking like a PlayStation 1 model. This means that traveling for more than a few kilometers from spawn gets pretty difficult. Since Scorching Engines is supposed to be an infinite world requiring exploration, that's not very good, as the world map has suddenly decreased from infinite down to a couple of kilometers across. Luckily, there is a very common solution for this problem used in most games with large distances, which is to use a floating origin. This basically means that you want to keep the player close to the origin of the world, 0, and therefore you typically teleport the entire world back towards spawn if the player has moved too far. However, it's a lot easier said than done, as there's no built-in method for this in Unity, so I had to do it myself. And now 4 weeks later, it's done. It just meant that I had to go through the hassle of teleporting every single entity and game object a large distance, fix the physics issues that are caused by that, such as the player being sent to space or falling through the ground, as well as my terrain generation and deformation, which was using the actual position of the terrain and not where it would be if it hadn't been teleported a kilometer, leading to the terrain repeating. Since most things in my game use this terrain sampling, such as vehicle movement, enemy vehicles, or the resources and city spawning, it is pretty important to fix that. But now we're done, right? If only. All the enemies use a Navmesh in order to move around on the terrain, the vehicle, or inside the buildings. And since that Navmesh doesn't automatically update when you shift the world, at least not all of it, as the terrain Navmesh actually does kind of work since it's using the built-in solution that Unity provides, which kind of makes it stick to the terrain piece. But the entities affecting Navmeshes, aka everything in the bandit camps, don't, as they use my homemade solution for Navmeshing entities since Unity doesn't provide one. After adding support for the floating origin to my system, which took longer than I care to admit, we just had one final Navmesh issue left. Which was the fact that when we shifted the world there was a massive lag spike caused by the Navmeshing freezing the game for a second or two. So I had to spend a bit of time making the Navmesh only be localized around the player, as there's no need for Navmeshes to exist where there's no need for the pathfinding, as enemies get frozen when the player is far away. This speeds up the Navmesh generation a fair bit, and one benefit of this is that Navmeshes are no longer a part of the terrain, so terrain generation is much faster and we save some memory. However, the enemy's AI is unfortunately not aware that we just teleported a kilometer, so their pathfinding route is outdated and they've just started a trek across the world, since they cannot abandon their patrol around the bandit camp. But after a little bit of work to clear the paths on origin shifts, it all works. So, just a small 4-week detour for something I had hoped I didn't have to do yet, but unfortunately it had to be done sooner rather than later. Once you've survived the final stand in the colony, and the heat core has finished charging, you just need to activate it in order to stave off the cold and keep the colony warm. Like I said, the art isn't done, but I want to have a nice effect where you can see the heat expanding from the vehicle, melting the snow and making the colony be a safe haven from the winter. So, I am apparently very bad at planning, at least when the planning includes making a devlog. But this time it surely won't be a year until the next one, as I've actually already finished the work needed for the next devlog regarding the building system, and then after that I'll do my very best to have more frequent, albeit shorter devlogs. If you're interested in scorching engines, you're very much welcome to wishlist it on Steam, as it helps tremendously. And you can join the Discord for the full development experience and not the curated devlogs, as I post stuff there that doesn't make it into the devlogs. Additionally, you can provide feedback and discuss features before and during implementation. Thank you very much for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.